So my dad died. Heart attack. 63 years old. Gone before the paramedics even got their equipment out of the truck. I got the call at work. And honestly, the whole next week was just a blur of casseroles from neighbors. The funeral was your typical Minnesota affair. Cold, gray, windy enough to flip the tent at the graveside. There were maybe 40 people there, which felt about right for a guy who kept himself after Mom passed. What I remember most was the smell of those cheap lilies they put everywhere, and Linda, my stepmom, standing there in her black dress with makeup that looked like she was heading to a nightclub instead of cemetery. Linda, that woman. Dad married her 6 years ago after meeting her at some community center dance class. She was 52 then, he was 57. I tried to be happy for him. I really did. Guy had been lonely for almost a decade after Mom died. But Linda always felt off to me. Too interested in what Dad owned. Too quick to suggest he update his will. Too comfortable spending his money on things like weekend trips to Branson and a brand new Lexus. But Dad seemed happy, so I kept my mouth shut. That's what you do, right? You want your parent to be happy in their golden years, even if their new spouse gives you the creeps. 3 days after the funeral, we all gathered at his attorney's office in downtown Minneapolis. The building was one of those old converted warehouses with exposed brick and those modern uncomfortable chairs that cost more than my monthly rent. Linda showed up in black again, but this time with fresh nails, bright red, tapping impatiently on the mahogany conference table. Her eyes were dry. They'd been dry at the funeral, too. Meanwhile, I'm sitting there with a wadded-up tissue in my pocket, trying not to lose it in front of strangers. The attorney, Mr. Peterson, was this older guy with reading glasses on a chain. He had that leather-bound folder lawyers always seem to have, and when he opened it, the pages made this dry, rustling sound that somehow made everything feel more final. He started with the standard stuff, some charitable donations, a few personal items to old friends. Then he got to the house. The house Dad had bought in 1987. The house I grew up in. The house he'd maintained like it was a classic car. 3-bedroom ranch in a decent neighborhood, worth about $500,000 in today's market. That house was basically Dad's entire estate, besides his retirement accounts. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat and read the relevant section. The house was being left to me, David, his only son. My heart did this weird skip thing. Not from greed, but from sentiment. That was my childhood home. That was where Mom had her garden. That was where Dad taught me to change a tire in the driveway. But then came the catch. The attorney kept reading. The house was mine, sure, but with something called a life estate for Linda. She had the right to live there until she died. I was what they called a remainder man, which is basically fancy legal talk for saying I owned the future rights to property, but couldn't do anything with it until she kicked the bucket. I sat there trying to process this. It made sense in a way. Dad didn't want to leave his wife homeless. But something about Linda's face made my stomach turn. She wasn't relieved. She was angry. Mr. Peterson finished reading and asked if there were any questions. Linda's jaw was tight. She asked about selling the property. Could she sell it and move somewhere warmer, maybe Florida? The attorney explained that no, the life estate meant she could live there but couldn't sell it. That right belonged to me as a remainder man, but I couldn't exercise it while she was alive and living there. The temperature in that office dropped about 20 degrees. Linda's pleasant widow act evaporated like summer rain on hot asphalt. She started asking pointed questions. What about modifications? What about repairs? What if she wanted to rent it out? The attorney patiently explained the limitations. She could live there, maintain it, but couldn't do anything that would damage the property's value. Then Linda made a comment that stuck with me. She said something about how she'd been counting on having full ownership, how she planned to take her money and start fresh somewhere warm. The attorney gave her this look, and that's when he mentioned the other part of Dad's estate. He left her $150,000 in a separate investment account. Outright. No strings attached. $150,000. That's not chump change. That's more than most people see in years. But Linda sat there acting like Dad had left her with nothing but pocket lint and food stamps. The meeting wrapped up pretty quick after that. Linda grabbed her copy of the will, shoved it in her designer purse, the one Dad bought her last Christmas, and stood up without a word. Mr. Peterson tried to explain some additional details about property taxes and insurance, but she was already halfway to the door. I followed her out to the parking lot, tried to talk to her, tried to say something about how Dad just wanted to make sure everyone was taken care of. She whipped around, and her face was this mask of cold fury. The grieving widow act was completely gone. She told me in this low, poisonous voice that I'd get the keys to that house when they pried them from her cold, dead hands, that it was her home now, her security, and I could wait my turn like a good little boy. She said Dad might have put my name on the paperwork, but she was going to live there until she was 90 if she had to, just to make sure I understood who was really in control. Then she got her Lexus, slammed the door hard enough that I heard it echo off the parking garage walls, and peeled out. I stood there in the cold November drizzle, still holding my copy of the will, and realized something important. This wasn't going to be a peaceful transition. This wasn't going to be two reasonable adults working together to honor Dad's wishes. This was going to be a war. And Linda had just fired the first shot. I looked down at the papers in my hand, at all Dad's careful planning and good intentions, and understood something he probably never considered. He'd tried to protect both of us. Instead, he just lit the fuse on a bomb that was going to blow up in both our faces. The parking garage was nearly empty now. My breath made little clouds in the cold air. Somewhere above me, a pigeon cooed from the rafters, and I made a decision right there. If Linda wanted to play this game, fine. But she was going to learn that just because you have the right to live somewhere doesn't mean you can do whatever you want with it. I just didn't know yet how badly this was all going to get before it got better. 6 months went by. 6 months of radio silence from Linda. No calls, no texts, not even a passive-aggressive Facebook post about how hard it was being a widow. I figured she was just living in the house, doing whatever stepmoms do when they inherit a life estate. Maybe she was taking care of the place. Maybe she was being reasonable. Yeah, I was an idiot. I found out through Facebook, of all places, that Linda had a new boyfriend. His name was Ron, and from his profile pictures, he looked like the kind of guy who wears Ed Hardy shirts unironically and probably has a DUI or 3. He sold something, insurance maybe, or timeshares. One of those jobs where you're never quite sure if the person is actually making money or just pretending really hard. Linda started posting photos from Ron's place. It was one of those newer townhomes on the other side of the city, the kind with vinyl siding and a 2-car garage. She was living there, not at Dad's house, at Ron's place. So if she wasn't living at the house, what was happening to it? That question kept me up at night. I'd drive by sometimes after work, just to check on things from the street. The grass was getting long. There was a rusty grill on the front lawn that definitely wasn't Dad's. One of the upstairs windows had what looked like a bedsheet hanging in it instead of curtains. But I couldn't get closer. I didn't have a key, and showing up on the property felt like crossing some invisible line that would make me the bad guy in the situation. Finally, I decided I needed to actually see what was going on. It was my house, legally speaking. Even if Linda had the right to live there, I had a responsibility to make sure the property wasn't falling apart. That's what I told myself. Anyway, I drove over on a Saturday morning in April. The weather was finally warming up, that first real spring day where you can smell the earth thawing. I pulled up to the curb and immediately knew something was wrong. The grass wasn't just long, it was waist-high in some places. The garden Mom had planted decades ago was completely overgrown with weeds. There were trash bags piled up near the side of the house, and the grill I'd seen before was covered in rust and looked like it hadn't been moved in months. I walked up to the front door, my old house key in my hand, tried to slide it into the lock. It didn't fit. My first thought was that I had the wrong key, which was stupid because I'd lived in this house for 18 years. But I tried it again anyway, jiggling it, forcing it. Nothing. The locks had been changed. I stood there on the porch, my dad's porch, the porch where he taught me to tie my shoes, and realized I couldn't even get into my own house. Well, technically my future house. But still, that's when I heard the music. Heavy bass, the kind that rattles windows, coming from inside. and then a dog started barking. Not a small dog, either. Something big and aggressive sounding. I knocked on the door. Pounded on it, actually. The music was too loud for a polite knock to work. No answer. Just more barking. I walked around the side of the house, careful not to trip over the trash bags. The fence gate was hanging off one hinge. The backyard looked even worse than the front. There was a car engine, an actual engine, sitting on the grass near the back patio. Who the hell takes apart a car engine in someone's backyard? One of the windows on the ground floor was covered with a piece of plywood and duct tape. I could see the edges where the glass had been broken. I called the police. I know how that sounds. Calling the cops on people in your own house. But I didn't know what else to do. There were clearly people living there who weren't Linda, and the place was falling apart, and I needed someone with authority to do something about it. 2 officers showed up about 20 minutes later. They were polite, professional. Asked me what the problem was. I explained the situation. Showed them my ID. Showed them the paperwork from the will showing I was a remainder man. They listened, nodded, and then asked to see Linda's paperwork. Turns out Linda had filed all the right documents with the county. She was listed as the life tenant with full legal possession. The older cop, the one with the gray mustache, explained it to me like I was a child who didn't understand how property rights worked. Linda had the legal right to possess the property. If she wanted to change the locks, that was her right. If she wanted to have other people living there, that was technically within her rights as the life tenant. The cops couldn't force entry without evidence of crime, and a messy yard wasn't crime. Then came the part that really twisted the knife. The younger cop, the one who looked like he graduated from the academy maybe 6 months ago, put his hand on his belt near his weapon and told me I needed to leave the property immediately. Me, leave the property. My property. The house my dad built his life in. The cop said if I didn't leave right then, he'd arrest me for trespassing. Trespassing on my own house. I asked him how that made any sense. He said it didn't matter what made sense to me. What mattered was the law, and legally, Linda had possession. I didn't. So I left. I got in my car and drove away while some stranger's dog barked from inside my childhood home, and the cops watched to make sure I actually left. I sat in a Culver's parking lot for about an hour, eating cheese curds I didn't taste, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't call Linda. She blocked my number months ago. I couldn't go to the house. The police had made it very clear that was off limits. I couldn't even hire someone to check on the place because legally, I had no right to authorize anyone to enter. I was stuck. Completely, totally stuck. And the worst part was knowing that every day that passed, the house was getting worse. Dad had maintained that place like clockwork. New roof every 20 years. Fresh paint every 5. He'd replaced the furnace 2 years before he died. And now it was rotting from the inside out while I sat in a parking lot eating cold cheese curds. The calls from the neighbors started about 2 weeks later. First, it was Mrs. Higgins from next door. She'd known my family since I was in elementary school. She called to ask if I knew there were loud parties at the house every weekend. People parking on her lawn. Beer cans in her flower beds. Then it was Mr. Brooks from across the street. He wanted to know if I was aware that someone was working on cars in the driveway at all hours. Oil stains all over the concrete. Parts everywhere. I told him the same thing I told myself. I couldn't do anything about it. Legally, my hands were tied. But the call that really got me was from Mrs. Higgins again, about a month later. Her voice was quiet, almost apologetic. She said she didn't want to bother me, but she thought I should know. They were taking the house apart. Not literally, but close. She'd seen people carrying out copper piping. Someone had removed the aluminum gutters. There were scorch marks on the garage door, like someone had tried to burn something. She asked me, in that polite way old Midwestern ladies have of asking uncomfortable questions, if I was planning to do something about it, because the whole neighborhood was starting to look bad, and property values were going to drop if things kept going the way they were going. I wanted to scream at her that, of course, I wanted to do something, that this was destroying me, that watching my dad's legacy get torn apart by strangers while my stepmom cash checks under the table was torture. But Mrs. Higgins didn't deserve that. She was just worried about her home, same as me. So I told her I was working on it, that I had a plan, that things would get better soon. I didn't have a plan. I had nothing, just a legal document that said I'd own a house someday. Maybe, if there was anything left of it by the time Linda finally died or moved out. That night, Mrs. Higgins called again. Her voice was even quieter this time, like she was afraid someone might hear her. She told me they were tearing apart a car engine right there on the front lawn, in broad daylight, oil everywhere. The whole thing was sitting in the grass my dad used to mow every Saturday morning. She said I needed to do something, not asking anymore, telling me, because whatever was happening in that house, it was only going to get worse. And for the first time since the parking lot confrontation with Linda, I felt something other than helplessness. I felt anger. Cold, calculating anger. Mrs. Higgins was right. I needed to do something. And I was about to figure out exactly what that something was. The letter came on a Wednesday. I remember because it was trash day, and I just rolled the bins back to the garage when I saw it sitting in my mailbox. Official county envelope. Return address from the treasurer's office. I knew before I even opened it that this was going to be bad. The words delinquent were stamped across the top in angry red ink. Property taxes on Dad's house hadn't been paid in 2 years. Not 1 year, 2 full years. The total with penalties and interest came to just over $8,000. But here's the thing that made my blood run cold. At the bottom of the letter, in smaller print, was a notice. The property was scheduled for a tax forfeiture sale in 30 days. That's government speak for an auction. If those taxes weren't paid within a month, the county would sell the house to recover what was owed. And if that happened, my rights as remainder man would be worthless. Gone. Erased. Like they never existed. I sat in my car and read that letter 3 times. Linda had lived in that house for months after Dad died. She'd had the legal right to possess it. And part of that right, part of her responsibility as a life tenant, was paying the property taxes. She hadn't paid a dime. Now I understood her game plan. She couldn't sell the house because of the life estate restriction, but if she let it go to a tax sale, she'd walk away clean. No house to maintain, no responsibilities. And she'd still have that $150,000 Dad left her sitting pretty in her investment account. Meanwhile, I'd lose everything. I should have panicked. Part of me wanted to. But sitting there in my driveway, staring at that red delinquent stamp, something clicked in my brain. This wasn't just a crisis. This was an opportunity. Linda had made a mistake. A huge, documented, provable mistake. She'd failed to pay property taxes on a house she was legally obligated to maintain. That wasn't just negligence. That was abandonment of her duties as a life tenant. I just needed to make her admit it. I drafted an email that night. Took me 2 hours to get the tone right. It needed to sound concerned, but firm. Like I was trying to solve a problem, not start a fight. I asked her about the tax bill. Mentioned that the roof was leaking based on what Mrs. Higgins had told me. Said we needed to work together to address these issues before the house was damaged beyond repair. I had sent around midnight and forced myself to go to bed. If Linda was smart, she'd ignore the email. Maybe call her own lawyer. Play it safe. But Linda wasn't smart. She was arrogant. The response came the next morning. I was at work, sitting in a meeting about quarterly projections or some other thing I couldn't care less about, when my phone buzzed. I glanced down and saw Linda's name in my inbox. I excused myself to the bathroom and opened the email. My hands were shaking, not from fear, from excitement. She'd taken the bait. The email was beautiful in its stupidity. She started by telling me to listen up, like she was talking to a child. Then she laid out her position in perfect, damning detail. The will gave her the right to live in the house. She wasn't going to spend her money fixing up my inheritance. If the roof was leaking, that was my problem as the future owner. If I wanted the house so badly, I could pay the taxes myself. She actually wrote that in an email, in writing. Permanent, forwarded, screenshot-able writing. I read it 3 times in that bathroom stall. The fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Someone washing their hands at the sink. Linda had just confessed to permissive waste. She'd admitted, in her own words, that she knew the property needed repairs and was refusing to address them. She confirmed that she hadn't paid the taxes and didn't intend to. Any lawyer worth their bar exam fee would see this email as a smoking gun. I took a screenshot. Then I forwarded it to my personal email. Then I saved it to my cloud storage. Then I took another screenshot of that. The property tax was due in 30 days. I had about $12,000 in my savings account. Paying $8,000 would hurt. It would hurt bad. That was money I'd been saving for a down payment on my own place, for a future that didn't involve living in a cramped apartment at 34 years old. But that $8,000 was an expense. It was an investment. It was the price of admission to ending this nightmare. I went to the bank the next day. The teller was this young woman, probably fresh out of college, who made cheerful small talk while she processed a withdrawal. Asked if I was doing something fun with the money, taking a trip maybe. I told her I was buying my freedom. She laughed like I'd made a joke. I wasn't joking. The county treasurer's office was one of those depressing government buildings that smells like old carpet and despair. The woman at the counter barely looked up when I handed her the check. She stamped paid across the notice, gave me a receipt, and that was it. $8,047. Gone. Just like that. The sound of her stamp hitting the paper felt like a hammer coming down on Linda's future. I walked out of that building feeling lighter than I had in months. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my phone, my laptop, and a beer I barely touched. I pulled up Linda's email and read it one more time. Every word was a nail in her coffin. Every sentence was proof that she'd violated her duties as a life tenant. I opened a new document and hit save as PDF. The file name was simple, evidence. Then I pulled up the contact information for an attorney. Not Mr. Peterson, Dad's old estate lawyer. I needed someone aggressive, someone who specialized in real estate litigation, someone who could take this evidence and turn it into a weapon. I found a firm downtown. Their website showed a bunch of lawyers in expensive suits standing in front of law books. The kind of people who charge $400 an hour and earn every penny. I filled out their contact form, attached Linda's email, and explained the situation in brief, clinical terms. The response came back in less than 12 hours. They wanted to meet. They thought I had a case. A strong case. I made the appointment for the following Tuesday. Before I went to bed that night, I did one more thing. I called the same attorney's office and asked a simple question. In Minnesota, what were the penalties for a life tenant who deliberately let a property deteriorate, who refused to pay taxes, who admitted in writing that they had no intention of maintaining the asset? The paralegal who answered put me on hold. When she came back, her voice had an edge of excitement to it. She said the word I'd been hoping to hear. Forfeiture. A life estate could be terminated if the tenant committed waste. And in Minnesota, the damages could be tripled under certain circumstances. Treble damages. 3 times whatever the court decided Linda had cost me. I hung up the phone and sat there in the dark of my apartment, the glow of my laptop screen the only light. Linda thought she'd won. She thought that life estate was an unbreakable shield. She thought she could do whatever she wanted, and I'd just have to wait until she died to get what was rightfully mine. She was wrong. The attorney's name was Sarah Mitchell, and she didn't mess around. Her office was on the 20th floor of one of those glass towers downtown, the kind where every surface is either polished granite or expensive wood. She was maybe 45, sharp suit, sharper eyes, the kind of lawyer who probably made junior associates cry. I liked her immediately. She read through Linda's email twice while I sat across from her desk. Didn't say a word, just read it with this tiny smile growing at the corner of her mouth. When she finally looked up, she tapped the paper with one perfectly manicured nail. She told me this was textbook waste. Not just any waste, but the kind that made law professors happy because it was so clear-cut. Linda had admitted in writing that she knew the property needed repairs and refused to make them. She'd failed to pay property taxes for 2 years, putting the entire asset at risk. And best of all, she'd done it with the kind of arrogance that made juries angry. Sarah explained the strategy. We weren't just going to sue for damages. We were going for the throat. forfeiture of the life estate, and treble damages under Minnesota statute. I asked what treble damages meant. Sarah leaned back in her chair and explained it like she was teaching a college course. In Minnesota, when someone commits waste on property, the court can award triple the actual damages. It's meant to punish bad actors and discourage this kind of behavior. So if we could prove $50,000 in damages, Linda would owe $150,000. I did the math in my head. That was exactly what Dad had left her in that investment account. Every penny. The next 2 months were a blur of documentation. Sarah hired an independent property appraiser, some guy named Tom who'd been evaluating houses for 30 years. I met him at the property on a gray Tuesday morning. Linda's tenants were gone by then, evicted by the city for code violations. The house was empty and accessible. Walking through that house was like touring a crime scene. The kitchen sink had been ripped out, probably for the copper pipes underneath. There were holes in the drywall where someone had punched through looking for wiring. The hardwood floors Dad had refinished 5 years ago were scratched and stained beyond repair. Tom took photos of everything, hundreds of them. The black mold growing in the bathroom, the collapsed ceiling in the master bedroom where the roof had leaked for months, the broken windows, the missing appliances. He measured, documented, made notes in a little tablet. When he was done, he gave me his preliminary assessment. The house had been worth around $500,000 when Dad died. Now, in its current condition, he wouldn't value it at more than $300,000, maybe $250,000 if he was being honest. $200,000 in lost value in less than 2 years. Sarah also subpoenaed police records. Turned out the cops had been called to the house 14 times in 18 months. Noise complaints, domestic disturbances. One report about someone trying to steal copper from the air conditioning unit. Every single incident was documented, dated, and attached to Linda's address as the property owner of record. We had the email. We had the appraisal. We had the police reports. We had my receipt for the property taxes I paid. Sarah put it all together in a filing that was over 100 pages long. The lawsuit was filed on a Thursday. Sarah handled the process server personally, made sure it was someone who wouldn't take no for an answer. Linda was served at Ron's townhouse 3 days later. According to the process server, she laughed. Actually laughed when she read the complaint. Told him to tell me that I was wasting my money on lawyers because a life estate was ironclad. She had the right to live there until she died, and no judge was going to change that. She didn't hire a lawyer. Not a real one. Anyway, she found some guy who ran a low-rent practice out of strip mall, the kind of attorney who does divorce work and traffic tickets. Probably charge her a couple $100. Sarah was thrilled. She told me that overconfident opponents were her favorite kind. They walked into court thinking they'd already won, and then reality hit them like a freight train. We spent the weeks before the court date preparing. Sarah grilled me on every detail. When did I first notice the property deteriorating? What did Linda say at the will reading? Had I tried to contact her about the maintenance issues? She wanted every answer to be perfect, unshakable. I showed her text messages, emails, even a voicemail where Linda told me to stop harassing her about the house. Sarah added all of it to file. The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in late September. I took the whole day off work. Wore my best suit, the one I bought for Dad's funeral. Sarah told me to look professional, but not flashy. We were the good guys here, the ones trying to preserve a family legacy. Linda showed up in jeans and a sweater. Her lawyer, if you could call him that, looked like he'd slept in his car. He had a single manila folder under his arm. One folder. Sarah had 3 bankers' boxes of evidence. We stood outside the courtroom, waiting for our turn. The hallway smelled like old coffee and stressed lawyers. Linda kept looking at me with this smirk, like she knew something I didn't. Like the whole thing was some kind of joke. Her lawyer tried to make small talk with Sarah, asked if we'd consider settling. Sarah told him we'd accept full forfeiture of the life estate and $150,000 in damages. He actually laughed, said there was no way a judge would terminate a life estate over some minor property issues. Sarah didn't respond, just adjusted one of her boxes and checked her watch. The bailiff called our case. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with paneling and fluorescent lights. The judge was already sitting at the bench, some older woman with reading glasses and a severe expression. She looked like she'd been doing this for decades and had seen every trick in the book. Linda walked past me to get to her table, leaned in close as she passed, and whispered just loud enough for me to hear. She asked if I knew the judge was going to laugh me out of court, said I'd wasted my money and my time, and she'd still be living in that house when I was old and gray. I didn't respond, just walked to my table, sat down next to Sarah, and watched as Linda took her seat across the aisle. Her lawyer was already shuffling through his single folder, looking for something. The judge asked if both parties were ready. Sarah stood up, confident and composed. She said we were ready, Your Honor. Linda's lawyer stood up too, but slower, less certain. He said they were ready as well. The judge nodded and told us to proceed. Sarah walked to front of the courtroom, and I swear I could feel the temperature drop. This was it. This was the moment everything came together or fell apart. And Linda still had that smirk on her face, like she'd already won. Sarah started slow. She introduced the case like she was telling a story to someone who'd never heard of property law before. She explained what life estate was, what remainderman's rights were, and most importantly, what duties came with being a life tenant. The judge listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. Then Sarah pulled out the first piece of evidence, Tom's appraisal report. She walked the judge through it page by page, showed photos of the house when Dad died versus photos from 2 months ago. The contrast was brutal. Clean, maintained family home on one side. Borderline, condemned property on the other. The judge leaned forward to look at the photos more closely. Her expression didn't change, but I saw her jaw tighten slightly. Sarah moved to the police reports next. 14 calls in 18 months. She read through each one. Loud parties, drug complaints, someone trying to strip copper from the AC unit at 3 a.m. Every single incident connected to Linda's address, Linda's property, Linda's responsibility. Linda's lawyer finally stood up to object, said the police reports were hearsay and didn't prove Linda knew about any of the incidents. The judge sustained the objection on technical grounds, but I could tell it didn't matter. The damage was done. She'd seen the pattern. Then came the tax records. Sarah presented the county's documentation, showing 2 full years of unpaid property taxes, showed the delinquency notice, showed the threat of forfeiture sale, and then, like she was revealing the final card in a poker game, she showed my receipt. She explained to the judge that I, the remainder man with no legal right to possess the property, had been forced to pay $8,000 to prevent the county from auctioning off my future inheritance. All because Linda, the life tenant with the legal duty to maintain the property, had simply refused to pay. Linda's lawyer stood up again, tried to argue that paying property taxes wasn't explicitly required under the life estate terms, that it was ambiguous who was responsible. The judge actually frowned at that. She asked Linda's lawyer if he was seriously arguing that a life tenant could let a property go to tax forfeiture and claim no responsibility. Her tone made it clear what she thought of that argument. He sat down pretty quickly after that. Then Sarah did something I wasn't expecting. She pulled out printouts of Linda's Facebook posts, photos of her at Ron's townhouse, posts about her new life, her new relationship, timestamps showing she hadn't lived at Dad's house in over a year. She wasn't just abandoning her maintenance duties. She was abandoning the property entirely while collecting rental income under the table. The judge asked Linda's lawyer if his client had been renting out the property. He stammered something about having no knowledge of any rental agreements. Sarah smiled. She presented statements from 3 neighbors, Mrs. Higgins, Mr. Brooks, another guy from down the street. All of them confirmed they'd seen different people living at the house. All of them had witnessed the deterioration firsthand. But the real knockout punch was still coming. Sarah turned to address the judge directly. She said she wanted to present one final piece of evidence, something that demonstrated not just negligence, but willful refusal to maintain the property. She handed the judge a printed copy of Linda's email. The courtroom went completely silent while the judge read it. I watched Linda's face go from smug to confused to pale. She hadn't expected this. She'd forgotten about that email, Or maybe she thought I wouldn't be stupid enough to use it against her. The judge read it twice. Then she looked up at Linda over her reading glasses. She asked Linda's lawyer if his client was prepared to defend this statement, the one where she explicitly admitted she had no intention of spending her money on repairs, the one where she told the future owner that the property's deterioration was his problem, not hers. Linda's lawyer asked for a recess. The judge denied it. She wanted an answer. He tried to spin it, said Linda was just frustrated, that the email didn't represent her actual position, that she'd been under emotional stress from losing her husband. Sarah countered immediately. She pointed out the email was sent 8 months after Dad's death, long past any reasonable period of grief. And more importantly, Linda's actions matched her words perfectly. She hadn't paid taxes, hadn't made repairs, hadn't maintained the property in any meaningful way. The judge set the papers down and removed her glasses. She looked tired, like this was exactly the kind of case she hated seeing, because it was so preventable, so unnecessarily cruel. She started by explaining the law, and her voice had this edge to it that made everyone in the courtroom sit up straighter. A life estate wasn't just a right to live somewhere. It came with responsibilities, serious responsibilities. The life tenant was essentially a fiduciary, a guardian of the property. They had to maintain it, pay the taxes, make necessary repairs, prevent waste, because they were holding the property in trust for the remainder man. Failing to pay property taxes wasn't just negligence. It was the most serious form of waste possible because it threatened the complete loss of the asset. Linda's lawyer tried to interrupt. The judge held up one hand, and he shut up immediately. She continued. She said, based on the evidence presented, Linda had committed substantial waste, not just failure to maintain, but active abandonment coupled with a documented refusal to fulfill her duties. The email alone would have been enough, but combined with everything else, it painted a picture of someone who deliberately chosen to let a $500,000 property rot. The judge announced she was terminating Linda's life estate effective immediately. Forfeiture, complete and total. Linda no longer had any rights to the property. I heard Linda gasp, actually gasp, like someone had punched her in the stomach. But the judge wasn't done. She moved on to damages. Tom's appraisal showed a loss in value of approximately $200,000. However, she was going to be conservative and set the damages at $50,000. That was purely the cost of necessary repairs to restore the property to its condition at the time of Dad's death. Linda's lawyer looked relieved. $50,000 was bad, but it wasn't catastrophic. Then the judge mentioned Minnesota Statute Section 561.17, treble damages for waste. $50,000 times 3, $150,000 total. Linda made this noise like a wounded animal. Her lawyer's face went white. I watched him flip through his single folder like he was going to find some magic solution in there. The judge ordered Linda to pay the full amount within 90 days. If she failed to pay, the judgment would be enforced through seizure of assets. Sarah stood up. She very politely mentioned to the judge that through discovery, they'd learned Linda had an investment account containing approximately $150,000, an inheritance from the deceased. The judge nodded slowly. She said that was convenient. She ordered a levy on that account to satisfy the judgment. Every penny Dad had left Linda was gone, just like that. $150,000 she thought was safely hers, now being transferred to me to pay for the damage she'd caused. Linda finally found her voice. She started yelling, said this wasn't fair, that Dad had wanted her to have that money, that I was stealing from her. The judge banged her gavel once and told Linda if she didn't control herself, she'd be held in contempt. Linda's lawyer put his hand on her arm and she shut up, but I could see tears running down her face. Real tears this time, not the fake crying from the funeral. The hearing was over. The judge left the bench. Sarah started packing up her boxes while I just sat there trying to process what had just happened. I'd won. Not just won. I'd annihilated her. Linda had to walk past me to leave the courtroom. She didn't say anything this time. Didn't even look at me. Just walked past with her discount lawyer trailing behind. probably calculating how quickly he could get away from this disaster. Outside the courthouse, Sarah shook my hand and congratulated me. She said she'd filed the necessary paperwork to transfer full ownership of the property to me and arrange for the levy on Linda's account. The whole process would take maybe 6 weeks. I asked her what Linda would do now. Sarah shrugged, said that wasn't our problem anymore. Linda had made her choices. I drove to the house that afternoon. My house. Completely, totally, finally mine. It looked worse in person than in the photos, but it was mine. I stood in the living room where Dad used to watch football games. The carpet was ruined. The walls needed paint. The kitchen was gutted. But underneath all the damage, it was still the same house. 6 months later, the house was almost livable again. I'd sunk another $40,000 into repairs, but the insurance money from the damage claim covered most of it. Linda's $150,000 was sitting in my account, slowly being spent on contractors and materials. Mrs. Higgins brought me cookies one day while I was painting the living room. She said it was good to see the house looking like a home again. Said Dad would be proud. I ran into Linda once, about a year after the court case. She was coming out of a dollar store in a bad part of town. She looked older, harder. She didn't say anything to me, just got in this beat-up Honda and drove away. Last I heard, she was living in a trailer park near the airport. Ron had dumped her when the money ran out. I'd love to say I felt bad for her, but I didn't. She'd made her choices. She thought she could take what wasn't hers and get away with it. Instead, she lost everything. And me? I live in Dad's house now. My house. Some nights I sit on the porch where he used to sit, and I think about how he tried to protect everyone. How his careful planning almost backfired. But in the end, maybe it worked out exactly how it needed to. Justice cost me 2 years, and a lot of stress and some of my savings. But it was worth every penny. So that's my story. Pretty wild ride, right? I'd love to hear what you guys think about how this all went down. Was I too harsh on Linda? Should I have tried to work things out differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And hey, if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more crazy legal battles and life lessons, hit that subscribe button and smash the like. It really helps the channel grow. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.